and where it's going. I'm Vaishali Sinha. I'm from a company called Renew Power, which is India's largest renewable energy company, and it's listed on NASDAQ. We prioritize women in leadership, and so I'm delighted to be moderating the session today. In alignment with this year's theme at Davos, which is cooperation in a fragmented world, and WEF's continuous mission to ensure that the state of the world is improving, I don't think gender can be left behind. I think there's much to be done. And as we walk around in Davos, it's good to see that it's being prioritized. But as always, there's a lot more to be done. And that's what we're going to be discussing here today. I'm quite proud, in fact, very proud, to be an Indian woman. Because in our constitution, it not only guarantees equality to women, but also provides the state with the power to take measures of positive discrimination in favor of women. That's quite encouraging for a lot of us. And often we just don't acknowledge it as much as we do. I also want to point out that in India's G20 presidency, women empowerment has been identified as a key pillar. And that shows how India is taking leadership and prioritizing gender equity. I would also like to take a second to just put on the table the positive steps India has been taken when it comes to women leadership. Also, if we look back, we in India have had a woman president, a woman prime minister, women ministers, and astronauts, etc. And that's something, again, which makes us really proud of what we are doing. I think historically also women have been the architects of the community and the society at large. So on that positive note, I also want to recognize the leadership which our Honorable Prime Minister has shown when it comes to inclusive growth and inclusive development in India. Whether it is around financial inclusion, whether it is around women's safety, health, hygiene, the initiatives which we've seen launched over the last few years have been significant. And I have traveled across the country as well and spoken to quite a few, and I think there is a sense of comfort. But is that enough? Perhaps not. And we have today Honorable Smriti Irani ji here to talk to us a little bit more about it. I'd like to invite her for a keynote address, but before that, I know you need absolutely no introduction, and I'm not going to try doing that either, because I'm going to be quite embarrassed. But I just want to let you know, Smriti ji, that all of us are super inspired by your leadership, not only in India, but even here at Davos. So thank you for being who you are and taking the leadership you do for all of us.
Thank you. It's a very optimistic note to begin with for somebody who's been a part of Indian politics for over 2.5 decades. I think that if I reflect on the views with which you seek to begin, there are two anomalies that I'd want to correct. Firstly, in the G20 presidency, India does not speak of female emancipation. We speak of women-led development. And I think that shift in narrative is indicative of one very important element. India has made an economic case for gender justice. We do not, as a nation, want to propagate, and I say so as a minister, no, but as a citizen, I do not want to propagate that women in my country are waiting for something to be doled out to them, that they are waiting to be empowered. The whole strategy, if you may so call it, of women-led development is an indication that if economically you want to be strengthened, if you want to not only check all the HDI indicators, but at the same time, if you want to grow beyond being the 5th largest economy in the world, you need to centralize the women's agenda. Now, for decades, what has been the women's agenda? Another part of your introduction was we are doing positive discrimination. Now, as a woman, let me say, I know what the brunt of discrimination feels like. And I do not want the men or any other gender, not only in my country or any part of the world, to undergo the fruits of that discrimination. So when you speak about the women's agenda, how do we make the economic case for it? Any of the women who are a part of this panel today Are we here by the virtue of just being women? No. We have created a case for ourselves to be on this panel today because of the output we give, not societally, not at the familial level, but financially or as professionals. So what is the economic case for gender justice, if you may so call it? In 2014, Prime Minister Modi began with a clarion call to build toilets. Now, Mr. Ghosh is better to speak on climate issues, but let me give you the context with which it has an economic impact. Firstly, what is the political impact? Never in the history of our democracy or any other democracy that I can think of has the head of state ever spoken about the very basic need of a woman. It is not politically glamorous. It is not socially spoken about. And he looked at that very basic need from 4-5 perspectives. One, if you want to ensure that you curtail the dropout of young girls, you need to ensure that they have a space for themselves for their sanitation needs. And at the same time, you create a consciousness very early in the education system, not only amongst young girls, but also young boys, that this is a need. Secondly, when he spoke about let's build toilets, he spoke from the ramparts of the Red Fort, which means he addressed 1 billion plus people and said that there is nothing to feel ashamed of when you speak about the very basic need of a woman. And he did so without it being a part of a political manifesto. Never in any election has a politician stood up and said, let me build toilets. He made it a topic of conversation, which became conversations at ease in families, but also at places of work, where he said, let's build individual toilets. But when you create a consciousness that this is a woman's need, you suddenly have companies and workplaces turning inwards, marketplaces saying, do we have that facility? Because it becomes a big narrative in your country. So in 1 year between 2014 to 15, and I'm sorry I'm taking so much time, he indicated, I want this done. I happened to be the Minister of Education then. In 1 year, we built toilets for young girls in every school in India. Which begets one question, why didn't we do this earlier? As you said, we'd had a female prime minister and we've had women in positions of power. Why didn't we do this earlier? We did this now, better late than never. But what is the economic impact of it? In 2013, there was a World Bank report which said that because of lack of sanitation, there's a negative burden of 6% on the GDP. But there was also, as a part of that report and that deliberation, exploration of data which said that 40% of sexual crime against women happened when they went out to defecate. So he addressed a workplace need, he addressed an academic need, he addressed a law and order need, he addressed a sanitation need, and he addressed the economic need. He addressed the health burden of women by just building that one toilet. So he created a social narrative. He created an administrative narrative. And I'm very proud that for the first time we had a prime minister who said, okay, it'll not suffice just to build a toilet. Let me also create an administrative protocol to look after menstrual hygiene. And how do you dispose of the waste? So they say God is in details. Prime Minister Modi is looking at God every day, in every segment. So let's make an economic case for gender justice. When we talk about Prime Minister Modi's ambitious plan, and again, like I said, Anita and Mr. Ghosh can speak volumes on that from an international and domestic context. Let's give every woman clean cooking fuel. Now, before he said, let's give every poor woman clean cooking fuel, he implored to the citizenry of India, can you give up your subsidy or a part of your comfort if you can afford it, so that I can help those who are marginalized? He didn't do this as a leader who said, I want this done. He involved every community to say, can we come together and service the needs of the poor? The country stood up and said, yes, I can afford it. We had 10 million people say, I can afford it. I'll give up my subsidy. They gave it up. And as an effect, 80 million women for the first time in their lives had access to clean cooking fuel. Now, he made an economic case for it. but also a health case for it. WHO says that when a woman receives that kind of a support, you reduce her carbon intake as compared to what she would possibly inhale, close to 140 cigarettes a day. So there was a health impact, there was a financial impact, but there was a community involvement to ensure that there's gender justice. So we can't, I think that the uniqueness of his leadership is, it's not just one facet, one announcement. There's a multiplier effect when he talks of gender justice. So what India says in this G20 presidency is that we believe in women-led development. Can you imagine bringing that narrative to the G20 table? Question is, why wasn't it a part of the agenda before? I'm glad as an Indian, it is a priority now.
Thank you, Smriti. Thank you for those remarks. And indeed, our Prime Minister has really shown leadership when it comes to women, and very grateful for that. In fact, on the Cook Stove program, I want to say that given the leadership he's shown, the private sector is now getting involved. As you know, nature-based solutions is an important segment which is going to be at the heart of, I guess, a lot of the sustainable initiatives we're going to see. And women are going to be a part of that, and they're going to be able to share economic value as we generate value in this segment. So I guess it is, as we have a lot of CEOs here, it's important for us to take note of these programs which the government takes leadership on, and take it forward and scale it up and do more. And we promise we'll do our bit there. Thank you so much for those very, very encouraging and informative remarks. I'd like to now introduce the panel here. We have eminent panelists here, and I'm glad to say that we have representation from around the world, from New York, from Delhi, Bangalore, and Bombay. So it's quite a diverse panel geographically. We have Arunabha Ghosh, who is from CEW and has been doing some great work. I've been at the receiving end of some of the initiatives which are really, really impactful. So thank you for what you do, Arunabha. It's great to have you around. We have Nelson here, who's the co-founder and chief business officer of C6 Energy. And as I invite you to make your comments, do share with the minister the genesis of your name. It's quite innovative, so I'll call upon you to do that as well. We have Anita Bhatia, who's the Deputy Executive Director for UN Women. She was at the World Bank before, and so again, thank you for the leadership you've shown globally, Anita. We have Kanika Pal here, who's the Director Sustainability at Unilever, and we look forward to hearing your views on what private sector can do to engage and get women to lead on the ground. Arunabha, you bring us the data and the trends, right? And so I'd like to hear from you on this topic. How do you see women leadership evolving, and is the data as strong as we'd like it to be, or there is much to be done? So let's look at the glass half full, Smriti ji, with your permission, because I think that's what gets us to do more. So, Arunabha, look forward to your views here.
Thank you very much. Namaskar. As Vaishali ji said, I run the Council on Energy, Environment and Water. We are one of India's leading climate and energy think tanks, and also a strategic partner to India's G20. Let me just pick up from where Smriti ji left off, because many of these initiatives that were highlighted, whether it is access to sanitation, whether it is access to clean cooking fuel, and I should say a program that is already underway right now of also access to tapped water in every single home. Another thing that holds back the participation of women in the economic dimension of the labor force. What does that help us do? We are in the energy world, Vaishali. The participation of women in the labor force globally is one of the lowest, compared to other economic sectors. Because energy was traditionally treated as big engineering, etc., and we often see these trends of women being in STEM programs but not getting employed and so forth. The other dimension is, how do you actually not go from the recipient of largest, but become an agent of change. So we at CEW decided to test this out. So we first surveyed, we see that, and one more thing, Smriti ji, I think you were listing many of the initiatives, but it's worthwhile listing more. The initiatives on financial inclusion, right? So now that, more than 90% of women have access to a bank account, we asked ourselves at CEW, okay, there's financial inclusion, there is clean cooking fuel and sanitation, but there is this whole new emerging clean energy sector. So how could women become agents of change within that? So we launched a program called Powering Livelihoods, which was to use distributed energy as a driver of livelihoods in rural areas. Now, you might think this is just a small side segment of the economy. CEW's analysis, Vaishali, you asked for numbers, it's a $50 billion market. So we then started supporting startups. And then I can say just in the last 2.5 years that we launched the program, there have been more than 13,000 technology deployments. These are solar food dryers, silk reeling machines, cold chain, milk chilling, and so on and so forth. 80% of the beneficiaries have been women. Now, what do I mean by beneficiaries? They are the ones who are buying these, but then setting up micro enterprises. Now, so let me give you just a few examples to illustrate, because these women have now come and presented to officials in the central government and state governments. One example, Lalita Devi from Uttar Pradesh. She's the leader of a farmer-producer company called Khet Kisan Producer Company. They use biomass-based cold storage to preserve the produce that the farmers, their members, were producing. They now have nearly $1 million sales, of which about 20% that additional sales is coming from that biomass-based storage. Elsewhere, there is, another lady, Neetu Tandon, Agra-based micro-entrepreneurs, using a solar-powered efficient motor-run machine to process all sorts of food ingredients, etc. She has now become a demo champion for that technology going around the world, across the country. Recently, another initiative that's worth mentioning, this year, India is promoting the International Year of Millets at the United Nations. But there's also something going on within the country, a program around natural farming. This program that began in the south of India with more than 160,000 women-run self-help groups becoming the nodes of change to train other women farmers who are operating in small plots of land, the small farmers who are often forgotten in general across the world, then using natural farming, agroforestry, growing. I personally met these farmers growing more than 15 crops on a single plot of land, and yet then also becoming the entrepreneurs for not just the crops they are producing, but also the kind of ingredients, etc., that go towards regenerating the soil. On the basis of all of this, now the finance minister has announced that there will be a 5-kilometer stretch on either side of the Ganga or natural farming. What I'm trying to say here is that once you deal with these very basic needs, you immediately then, and in a very short span of time, you're able to integrate women's entrepreneurship, you're able to integrate sustainability, climate impact, energy access, you're able to bring in financial inclusion, you're able to promote innovation, and guess what? It becomes a very, very large fortune at the so-called bottom of the pyramid.
Thanks, Arunabha. As always, insightful projects, impactful projects. And, I was on a session with the co-founder of LinkedIn just yesterday. And we were talking about lack of inclusion in green jobs. And when I hear what you're saying, I think there is a whole unorganized segment of women in these areas which needs to be captured. And so my request is perhaps CEW should do some work in trying to partner and see how we can sort of, capture the potential we have in India of women who are working on the ground. And perhaps there are more women working on the ground in the remotest parts of our country than they are in, I would say, tier 1 and tier 2 cities in this area of green jobs, etc. So perhaps with that note, thanks a lot for what you do.
Just 15 seconds just
Sure.
on that. Based on all these experiences, I just want to underscore once again, these are not just anecdotes. These are in the tens of thousands of what's going on. And based on these experiences, Government of India has come out with the first policy of its kind in the world to use distributed renewable energy for livelihood activities. And now state governments in UP and Bihar, elsewhere, their rural livelihood missions, which are some of the largest in the world, are now incorporating this dimension. So it's very important that we just don't think of them as anecdotes, but something that is very much becoming mainstream.
Absolutely. Thanks, Arunabha. I'll come to you, Anita, now. With this topic, which is cooperation in a fragmented world, with respect to women-led development, how do you view India from the lens, which is quite a global lens, you have sort of access to? And your comments on that would be very useful.
Let me start by first saying that as Deputy Executive Director of UN Women and Assistant Secretary General of the UN, we do have, the ability to look globally and look at a variety of experiences. And while we put out global data on what is the situation of gender equality broadly in the world, we also know that there's a huge variation in that. So I do want to share some global data first and then come to this issue of how does India show up? So on the global data, we have just published, a flagship report that we put out every year, which is Progress on SDG 5. As this discussion shows, focusing on SDG 5 unlocks all sorts of other benefits. But that report has some pretty depressing data, and I'll just leave 3 data points with all of you to remember. One, that our research shows that at the current rate of progress, it will probably take 287 years to close the gap in terms of elimination of discriminatory laws across the world. Remember, not in India, but there are many parts of the world still where women cannot open bank accounts without getting approval from a man. There are parts of the world where women do not have the right to own property in the same way. And there are parts of the world where when there is violence against women, it is the woman who is taken to a jail, not the man. So there are all kinds of funky and weird laws out there that need to be removed. So that's one. The second data point I want to share is that our research shows that it will take 140 years before we get workplace parity in leadership, meaning until you have 50-50 men and women. Now, if you're in India, you might not think this is a reasonable number because you actually see a lot of women in leadership. But again, I just want to say, out of the 193 member states of the United Nations, there are only 14 that have gender equal cabinets. And that's not for a lack of qualified women. It's that, people don't work hard enough and don't care enough about the issue. And that's a flippant way of saying many other things that lie behind that. And then the third point is on when are we going to see equal representation in parliaments? Because even today, only 25% of parliamentarians worldwide are women. So our estimates are it's going to take at least another 40 years at this rate of progress. So that's the global picture. Now let me come to India. That show immediate results but and have near-term benefits. But what was really impressive to me, not just personally as an Indian, and I have to say it made me feel very proud to be an Indian woman, but just looking across during the pandemic, when we all had time to reflect on what was working and what was not working, it was very obvious very quickly where were women getting access to resources during the pandemic, and where were women not getting access to resources, and how were countries really dealing with this once-in-a-century shock. And one of the things we saw, which I talk a lot about, is the fact that because we have taken, I feel in India, what is very lacking in development in general is a systems approach to issues. We do not generally try to solve problems from a systems approach in development. Having worked in development for many decades, I will say, development is flawed in its approach. Development policy and work is often flawed in its approach because you are solving for one particular issue without looking at it as a system. What we just heard is a description of how you think about things as a system, and you understand root causes, and then you solve for things, and you intervene in a way where you have significant domino effects on a range of issues. So we saw that actually during the pandemic in India, because the fact that you had enabling environment in terms of digital identity meant you could get money into the hands of women. And there were very few parts of the world, and we track this, very few parts of the world where you could say, there are 200 million women who got access to money during the pandemic. This was huge. In fact, in many countries, there were immediate fiscal stimulus programs, but the money actually didn't reach the intended beneficiaries because there was corruption in the system and money got diverted. So that, I think, is very impressive. I think on the issue of leveraging existing infrastructure, I think many of the initiatives that Smriti ji described demonstrate the systems approach. And this is where I think, the G20 presidency just offers such a fabulous opportunity to take the lessons of what works in India, because what works in India works at scale. And so if it can work in India, it can work in many other parts of the world, and we don't do enough of this knowledge sharing. So I really see the G20 platform as a way to take the lessons of experience of India and just share them massively in an open source way and give it away to the world, because the world is desperately in need of solutions, and India has many of them. One last point on this whole issue of, we have not seen many countries where people talk about women-led development. Okay, people talk about gender equality. You have a lot of countries who have historically, because of their social systems and their taxation systems, been able to foster more visibility, if you will, of women, and where you have public policies, including paternity policies and social norms and attitudes that lead to more representation, more decision-making. But the thing is, it's not just about representation, though I also want to say that in India, at the local level, what we have done in terms of women in panchayats and in local governments is huge. Do people know this story? Not really. So we need to get the word out about how you can actually change representation at the local level and really drive outcomes that then reflect the needs of the beneficiaries. Last point I will say is that I think, in addition to the opportunity offered by G20, and UN Women is a strategic partner to the government on G20 and women-led development, etc., I think the one area that everybody needs to work on if we want to do better on the whole issue of gender equality, and it's not just India, is social norms. Attitudes, mindsets, behaviors, and that is something that is not just a matter of public policy, but it's got to be done at the individual level. So that's something that I think we all need to work on.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you for your views. And, all I want to say is that I think the time where India just shares information with the rest of the world I think, has passed. I think India is in a strong position to take leadership and sponsorship in certain countries where we can really talk about what we've done, lead there, and influence others in other parts of the world as well. And so really appreciate your global genderamic view. I just coined the term here. We just got a good lens of what's happening in the world and what are the areas we really need to work on, because the data doesn't look as good as we'd like it to. So thanks for the good work you're doing, and I read your reports with great interest. Coming to you, Nelson, C6 Energy, right? You have to start very quickly with the genesis of this name. I want to congratulate you for having a woman co-founder who's made it to all some of the most coveted lists of leadership, women leadership in STEM. Many women aspire to get there. How can we get more women engaged in STEM? I think that's critical for us to even include them in, the energy transition as well, and other areas you're working on. So would love to hear from you.
Sure, glad to share that. First, C6 Energy, I'm Chief Technology Officer at C6 Energy. And the name comes from the fact, since you asked, about carbon coming from the sea. So we grow seaweeds on a large scale to make a whole variety of products from them, including bioplastics. So since carbon is the sixth element on the periodic table, it comes as C6. But coming to leadership of women in STEM, what I'm really proud of is at C6, we're like 50% of our co-founders are women. 50% of our board are women. And not because, we had a plan to make that happen, because that was how it was. And when we talk about economic incentives for more, women leaders to come out, I mean, it's super obvious. Why would we deny 50% of our talent pool if we really want to grow and, grow as a country? And how I see it is, today we have, in STEM, we want more and more participation from women coming in. We try our best, and when we look for people to get that. And this is particularly important for me also being the father of a 1.5-year-old daughter. When she grows up, how is the world going to be like, right? And what you said about social norms is so important. Now, why so? Like, the way I see, Soumya, my co-founder, who's also here at Davos speaking.
CEO, and you're the CTO?
He's a chief business officer, yeah. We're also married, right? So the thing happens now, when my daughter grows up, she's going to see her mom, and she's going to have a certain idea of, okay, this is how the world is going to be. But that's not the case for every girl out there. How do we bring up more success stories like this in every field, and just break that, it's like an invisible thought in people's head that, oh, maybe I can't do this. But just that, hey, this person can do it, this person is doing it and doing it so successfully. And why is it so important? It's because I think, all the women here, while talent is the same, I believe that because of social norms, women have the starting line is so much further behind. So for everyone to come up here, that's really a huge achievement. And how do we make that known to more and more known girls out there? Because I think that is the level at which the change begins to happen, the mindset begins to change, and that's when really we can see more and more inclusion happening in the future.
Great, thanks. So it's not equality, it's equity, really, because that's what's going to really have the impact we're all looking for. And that brings me to you, Kanika. You lead sustainability at Unilever, and Unilever is really doing some great work in this area. They walk the talk on DEI. We'd all love to hear from you on some of the impactful initiatives, and if you can talk about the community initiatives, because I follow some of them, that'll be great.
Sure, thanks, Vaishali, and a very good morning, everyone. It's my honor and privilege to be seated here with this illustrious panelists, especially ma'am Smriti Irani, and we've met, an ardent fan of how you poise yourself with your oratory skills, and so much for us to learn as young women in the workforce. With that, of course, at Unilever, I think it's my honor and privilege to also share that we've been talking about STEM. We are already gender balanced in R&D at HUL. And that itself speaks volumes, because to be gender balanced in any organization, it's not just about having a target and meeting the target, but really looking at, from a systemic lens, what goes in private sector to enable women to come back, especially after they've had their child and come back into the workforce. That's exactly the time period when women drop out of the workforce. And if one were to go by the recent WEF reports, it'll take 134 years for gender parity to come about in workforce. That is a huge number. It won't happen in my lifetime. It would probably not even happen in my child's lifetime. And as a young mother myself, I think the enabling ecosystem at an organization like Unilever stems from not just the kind of childcare that is provided, but also looking at gender-balanced policies. I think it's very important, the ownership of men and participation of men when it comes to the gender narrative. So when there's a policy which is made, especially in the wake of the pandemic, we knew that domestic violence was on an increase. And as an organization, we did ensure that there are policies at place which helped women to deal with domestic violence, and as much for men on mental health. And these things combined together really have an impact on the workforce being able to really be productive when they come in. Overarchingly, from a community lens, I work a lot in rural India. And Arunama, when you were quoting about, the women leaders, I want to quote too from somebody which is, and to the list of all the policies that we have, Poshan 2.0 has really enabled a lot of change for young mothers, especially in their reproductive ages. And some of the work that we drive in the community systems, and which is also one of the reasons why here I'm at WEF, is because of the work that got recognized as a social innovation called Prabhat. What that does is looks at community investments from a perspective of really looking at economic empowerment for women in a manner that every time we are, even if from livelihood, nutrition, or for that matter, water space, from an agri-water and women in farming perspective, we are able to create a holistic synergy for the women to be much more empowered. I want to quote, in Hamirpur district, Sumerpur mein, we have a factory which is working there since many years. And Anjana is a 19-year-old girl who essentially has been trained as a Poshan Saathi in one of our programs. And she goes from village to village, along with the Asha Didis, to actually talk about access to nutrition. And while doing that, we've heard stories of how she's engaged with the men folk to actually convince them to undergo vasectomy instead of the woman undergoing sterilization. Now, this is true empowerment for a woman on the ground. A woman who's able to actually make that better health choice for herself with the involvement of a family is really what's happening at the grassroots level. And that too, imagine by a 19-year-old who is able to convince a family of 30, 35-year-old, right? So essentially for us, I think the private sector has a huge amount of opportunity to be the torchbearers, be it in the formal economy or even in the informal economy, from all the work that's being carried out in the communities.
Thank you, Kanika. And I really do believe that, in India, especially in rural India, when women are determined, they can really bring about the change. I want to share a small experience. At Renew Power, we are working on reskilling salt pan workers to become solar technicians. And I was there along with Shambi, and we were doing a homestay in Gujarat, in the Ran of Kutch. And we met a lot of the men there. And they were saying that every morning they get up and they're ready to drop their women off to the training center because they know that they're going to increase their savings by 10 times of what they make as salt pan workers. So this is a program called Surya, where we are reskilling women to become solar technicians. And whatever we do, I think our renewable energy targets, as our Prime Minister does, he sets high targets. So in 2015, when the Honorable Prime Minister had set the target of renewable energy generation at 175 gigawatts, we were only at 40 gigawatts. And we were all like, impossible, we'll never get there. We got there, we are now, that was by 2022. We are there and we are looking at 500 gigawatts by 2030. right? And what does that mean? That means everybody says, oh, there's no manpower in this area. I mean, there is woman power. We really have to tap and unleash the potential of so many women who are there on the ground doing what they do because they're really committed. You know, when women get engaged, they're committed, they have the impact, and as all of us agree, we can't leave them behind. Smriti ji, I want to ask you one question before we wrap up, if you have the time, and then we'll close the session. You've talked a lot about what the government's doing and is doing a lot. And often we don't understand how much the government is doing. So thank you for really doing that. In every session I've left, I've almost felt embarrassed about how little I knew about the government's policies. So I'll keep trying. But what do you think the private sector can do to be in tandem and to scale this? Because I think that's quite a need of the hour as well.
Okay, I have a long laundry list. Firstly, I think that what is the change of narrative that affects the psychology behind gender justice? Anita has given you a global context to how women are perceived and responded to by nation states. What is the test of a nation's level of acceptance for a woman's right to live her life with dignity? What is the test of a nation's deep attitude genuinely towards a woman's reproductive rights? What is the test of a nation's polity's empathy towards women's rights, if you so may call it? There is an article of legislation that was pending for 4 decades, which had to do with medical termination of pregnancy at 24 weeks. When it was proposed in Parliament, there was no whimper from any political organization saying, do not do this. When it was debated in Parliament, there was not a single Indian man who stood up. How dare you? Not a man said in India. It passed both houses of Parliament, and now it is law. It was led by a male Prime Minister. It was a consensus between all political ideologies. And you're right, it never made news. But imagine that at the headquarters where Anita works. Would be a possibility there? Nope. It happened in India. And that one decision reflects what India stands for today. Men and women stand for today. So when we talk about what is it that I ask of private sector, I think that attitude towards narrative. Mr. Ghosh was kind enough to illustrate the entry-level power of women, especially when it comes to renewables, especially when it comes to climate consciousness towards business opportunities. What would I want? I want more women in mid-sized companies. I want more women in STEM, not as entry-level operators in labs. I want women to own science-based businesses. And I think I want women to be exhibited, and I'm using that word with a sense of deep humility, and I hope I'm not being unjust in saying that exhibition of that talent, because with every experience comes a cost. So when Anita says, let's share our experiences, you are sharing an experience which has come at the cost of either a success or a failure. And what does that tell you about the Indian way of living and sharing? We are telling the world, this is what we managed to do as a part of consensus. This is what we managed to do as a part of coercion, of narrative. This is what we managed to do because not out of a desire to display how great we are, but out of a desire to say we will stand up in unison to effect that social change. So at Davos, today as we speak on gender justice, we do so early in the morning. We do so not very honestly with many multiple voices from advanced economies that Anita speaks of and is polite enough not to name. We speak because we know what is about to happen in the future. And I come back to the Prime Minister's leadership. I've always said this, and Anita knows this. I've said leadership is not about firefighting in the present alone. It is about preparing your country for what comes next. Let me give you a small example. Mr. Ghosh spoke about the water project, fuel, academics, health. What comes behind this effort? When Prime Minister Modi announced the health plan Ayushman Bharat, everybody said, okay, 500 million people in this country called India will receive access for 1,300 diseases for monies that is not to be paid by them but by the government. And in 26,000 hospitals, we will see benefits. Let's see. Nobody talks about this in the rest of the world where healthcare systems are broken. We have seen in every minute 120 new beneficiaries identified in our country. That's a huge volume. Every minute, close to 28 people accessing a medical institutions free of cost because the government supports them. But what is the gender fantastic data that I can share? 100 million women in India have gotten themselves tested for the cancer of the cervix and breast. Who in the Western world would have thought that Indian women will stand and talk about it without being squeamish, especially from the rural landscape that we thrive on? 100 million women were not squeamish, walked up to a hospital, got themselves tested, then got a medical intervention done, came back home. That's impact, which is never spoken of, but that needs to be said. That when you invest in women and you fuel their capacity to consume, you fuel the health sector, you fuel academics, you fuel enterprise. So my ask, let's find more credit support for women to go from entry-level enterprise to mid-sized companies. Because it is, yes, a cause of celebration that so many women, 320 million small loans given in India, 70% were taken by women, which means 70% of that 320 million were women who said, I know how to draw a business plan. I know how to go to a bank. That was not a gendered financial intervention. I know how to go to a bank. I know how to get that money, work it, and then pay it back because the NPA is 1%. But what is a narrative? Like you rightfully said, let's look at the glass half full and address the fact there's much to be done. But I say, for how long do we say, oh yes, much to be done, and not celebrate what we have done, what many have not managed across the globe? It makes me sound like an arrogant Indian, but hell, we've done it together as a country, not only as a leader. He brought communities together. And that is what we celebrate. When the world is so fragmented domestically, internationally, India manages to come together in a crisis. And as Anita said, the pandemic was the best test. Is this the last pandemic? Can you guarantee it? But what we as Indians can guarantee, the next time we are hit, we will come together, not for only our benefit, but for that of the world. The world was dialing India when there was less vaccine, when there was less medicine. We became the pharmacy of the world. PPE suits, global supply chains shut down. Textiles is 70% women. They showed up and said, tell us how to stitch a suit. We will do it for you. We went from 0 companies in March to 1,100 companies in just 3 months. And the second largest exporters in the world. Why? Women showed up. Men showed up. And I think there are 4 asks. 1, credit so that women go from entry-level enterprise to mid-sized company. 2nd, the challenge of gender in algorithm and data. Because when you speak about labor force participation, are you telling me women in the informal aspects of your economy don't matter? They do. So when you look at the old adage of how do you test opportunities for women in formal and informal sectors, what was the challenge? The challenge was when you formalize a woman's economic participation, you give her access to insurance, correct? You give her access to medical facilities, correct? Those were the 2 things. And you have pay parity is what you push. Today in your country, you have insurance for men and women alike for 1 rupee. A coverage of 200,000 rupees for a premium of 1 rupee. less than what it takes to buy this cup of coffee here in Davos. Much, much less. So you've taken care of that segment. You have Ayushman Bharat that gives you access free of cost to medical institutions. Kanika spoke about the program. 120 million women and children, doorstep delivery of their nutritional needs, tracked digitally, and 30 million women given bank transfers of cash. Why? All because the government says, please engage in institutional delivery, get yourself vaccinated, get your medical checkups done while you're pregnant. The government is even supporting the life cycle of a woman and a child. So my second is the algorithm gender bias, which has to be somewhere addressed. Because when you talk data and you make a case for women, or men for that matter, on the basis of data, how much of that data is gendered, factors in what we've been doing across. For instance, I spoke about, and I told Anita while Kanika spoke, she says, oh, the domestic violence increased. I looked at Anita and I said, this is your mess. Why? Because when lockdown happened, somebody in New York got up and said, every woman in India must be getting beaten up at home. I called her in New York and I said, why would such a statement be made? You think that we are such a crude society that families are in lockdown and everybody is beating up women? But look at the danger of narratives which are not addressed. So let me give you a different view to it. We had 703 crisis centers running in every district, 35 women helplines, and all state police. And the only thing we did in this ministry, called Women and Child Development, was track every phone call. 220 million calls and engagements over 8 years. We have data for it individually. And we said, we are not shutting down our emergency services because there's a global lockdown. We will address every call. But the danger of the narrative once set and not countered becomes a part of corporate philosophy. That, I think, has to be also looked at. And lastly, there is still a case to be made for the economics of gender parity in STEM. There is still a case to be made for the economic, somewhere a reason behind making women not consumers of a digital world, but business owners of a digital world. That is a gap that is still to be covered, not only in India, but across the world. Because, as Kanika says, we talk about academics. Today, how many of us proudly say that the number of girls who enroll themselves in higher education in India beats the number of men? That we contribute to 40% of STEM graduates across the world who are women. 43% of our STEM graduates are women. So how do we help them transition from just jobs in STEM to business leaders? Because families need to see profit in engaging with science. And let me say what happens when women lead in areas of STEM. Kanika gave an R&D example for her company. Look at the Mars mission. The United States spent $671 million on a space adventure to Mars. India spent $70 million. And the mission was led by a woman, 2 deputies who happened to be women. We never speak of that example. True. That we speak about gender justice from an economic and a social, I think, perspective is good. Let's start making a case for it in the new world. We have pronounced the largest hydrogen mission in the world, 600,000 new jobs. How many precision engineers in that segment will be women should be our next target. That we as a country are hungry, as you very kindly said, that when Prime Minister pronounced we will reach this capacity of green energy, even domestically people said, can we? And now I don't want to sound like Mr. Obama, but we proved we actually can when nobody believed us. But what is the quintessential India story while we sell, and I'm saying this dispassionately, while we send our gender agenda at Davos, is that when the world's back was to the wall during the pandemic, we never commercially exploited that misery. We said, 150 countries, we said, you need medicine, we are shipping it to you. You need vaccine, we are shipping it to you. You need PPE suits, we are shipping it to you. And that is why, apart from the women's agenda in G20, we can proudly as Indians tell the world that we have redefined globalization. We have made globalization gendered, and we have made it human-centric. Thank you.
Thank you, Smriti ji. Thank you so much. Thank you for those remarks. And I think your 4 asks really cover a canvas which goes across the government, the private sector, families, educational institutions, academia. I think everybody is listening. This is being live streamed. So thank you for those comments. I just want to say on my last point that our Prime Minister really has shown the way when the rest of the world never thought of things. And from the sector which I come from, which is the renewable energy space, Prime Minister Modi had inaugurated our first wind farm in Jasdan in Gujarat. And at that time, global investors weren't convinced about an independent power producing model. And he was. And I remember he was standing there and pointing us to rivers and saying, why don't you put solar panels on top of it? And we were, again, if I could say embarrassingly, really, and so it's just amazing to see the leadership of our country in all things which go beyond gender. And thank you for the leadership. Really appreciate your taking out this time. Thank you to all the panelists for making such great points and getting us to think more. Hopefully, we'll go back and do a lot more. Thanks, everybody. Thank you.